With pleasure, with pleasure. Yeah, thank you, Stefan, for having me. So this is one of my current favorite topics currently because a lot of my customers needs this topic, and it's called module federation. I will show you how to combine this with Angular. And for this, I want to start with a picture with this here. Perhaps you've seen it before. It was drawn by Leonardo da Vinci. In 1400 something, he designed a helicopter like this. In 1400 something, how cool is that? The thing is, he only designed this helicopter because he didn't have the right material for building it. But nowadays we have the right material, and scientists tried to build it and they found out it really flies. How cool is that? And this little story somehow reminds me to micro frontends, because the idea has been around for years. But so far we lacked of the right material. We didn't have the right material to build it in a proper way. But first of all, what do I mean when I'm speaking about micro frontends? Well, basically, I just mean that we are subdividing a big application into tiny parts. So instead of writing, in this case, a flight application, we are writing a booking application, a luggage application, a check-in application, and a boarding application. Obviously, this reduces the complexity of each of those parts. Plus, we can assign separate teams to those parts. That means each team can work on their part independently. They can extend it, they can add features, they can deploy it, and they don't need to speak much without each other. They don't need to coordinate with each other. They don't slow each other down. That means even though we have big software systems, we get back the agility of tiny teams. But the thing is, having a huge amount of micro frontends is not enough. It's cool for us developers. It's not cool for the user, because the user don't want to start 50 applications each and every morning. They want to have one integrated application. And so we have to find a way to load all those tiny applications into a bigger one that looks like one integrated stuff for the users. I'm calling this bigger application the shell. Here I have a very tiny example for a shell. You have a main menu here, and when clicking here or there, separately compiled, separately deployed clients are loaded into its working area. Here, for instance, the client from localhost 3000 is loaded here into this working area. And the thing is, and this closes the cycle to the story of Leonardo da Vinci, this was not really possible before. Well, we could have used some dirty workarounds, but there was no nice, straightforward way for achieving this, for loading one single page application into another one. And this is changing now. Webpack 5 module federation is changing this. And this is what this whole talk is about, isn't it? I will start with module federation in general, and then I want to show you how to use it together with Angular. And also then I will give you a roadmap so that you know when you can use it for your big enterprise applications. But first of all, let me introduce myself. I am Manfred. I am a trainer and consultant for Angular. I am helping a lot of people around the world with Angular, especially Angular in the enterprise area, Angular for enterprise scale applications. And I'm also quite connected to the Angular community. I live in Austria. This is where my accent comes from. I'm doing a lot of stuff in Germany, and I'm always happy if I can work together with people around the world, companies around the world. Nowadays, this is quite simple because in days like this, we are doing everything remotely, don't we? Okay, so let's get started with the first chapter, with Webpack 5 module federation in general. There is one big question this new technology is answering, namely this here: how to load separately compiled code. And perhaps you say now, yeah, come on, Manfred, that cannot be that difficult because we have dynamic imports. And even before, we had the require statement. So why not use this statement to point to another application to load something from this application from over there? Well, the thing is, in theory, this works perfectly. In theory. In practice, this doesn't work at all with current bundling solutions like Webpack or other bundlers. And so it doesn't work with the Angular CLI either, because the Angular CLI is using Webpack underneath the covers. The reason for this limitation is that Webpack and all the other bundlers assume that everything is known at compile time. Everything needs to be there at compile time because everything is built together, everything is optimized together. Think about tree shaking, for instance, and then everything is cut into tiny pieces for the sake of lazy loading. But only then, and that's too late because we have a lot of different stuff upfront. We don't need to know everything at runtime. We don't need to know everything at compile time. We only need to know things at runtime when going with micro frontends. So this here would be too late. And so we get a sound solution for this by Webpack 5 and Module Federation. For this, Module Federation is introducing two roles. The first role is the host. I'm calling it the shell. And the second role is the remote. I'm calling it the micro frontend. And with Module Federation, you can configure both roles. For instance, you could define that the shell gets a mapped path, this URL here, MFE1, which stands for micro frontend 1. And so I can tell the shell, hey, this path, this URL, MFE1, points over there to this micro frontend that has been separately deployed. And by the way, over there, it's also called MFE1. That's not a prerequisite. We can call it differently over there. We can call it, let's say, Manfred or Batman or Bruce Wayne over there would be completely okay. So this allows me to define an alias. On the other side, I can expose stuff. I can expose Angular components, Angular modules, just functions, just classes. It's really up to us. Everything I'm exposing gets a nicely mapped name like CMB for component. And now something beautiful happens. I guarantee you will love it. Now you can use a dynamic import in your shell. This dynamic import is leveraging the mapped paths, MFE1 and CMB, and so it points over there to this separately compiled and deployed application. It allows us to load the exposed stuff from over there. And the best of this is Angular does not recognize at all that we are going with module federation here, that we are loading separated compiled stuff. Because for Angular, this is just lazy loading. It is just a dynamic import. Underneath the covers, Webpack and Module Federation are doing the heavy lifting. Of course, to make the host capable of loading the micro frontend, it needs some metadata about the micro frontend. And this metadata is compiled into a so-called remote entry point. The remote entry point is emitted by Webpack when compiling the micro frontend. It's just a tiny file with a very tiny amount of bytes. And this file with the metadata should be loaded into the shell upfront. You can do it with a scrap tag. You can also do it in a more dynamic way by calling a function at runtime. This guarantees that the shell knows about the remote, that the shell knows about its URL and about other stuff it needs to consider when loading it. Of course, we also need to share libraries. Let's assume we are going with Angular. In this case, we have Angular core and all the other Angular libraries in the shell, but we also have it within the micro frontend. And obviously, we don't want to load it twice. Or let's say we have 10 micro frontends. In this case, we don't want to load it 10 times. No, we just want to load it one time. And so it's really cool to know that we can define several NPM packages as shared packages. If it is defined as shared on the left side and on the right side, it's only loaded once. And obviously, this brings a lot of performance because we don't need to download several things several times. Okay, so as you have seen, this is quite straightforward. But now the question arises how to combine this with the Angular CLI. Because the thing is, the Angular CLI is using Webpack underneath the covers. This is great. But the thing is also, it is shielding Webpack from us. And normally this is also great, because normally that means we do not need to mess around with the Webpack configuration. That can be quite complex, can't it? But in our case, this is a drawback, because in our case, we have the module federation config, and we want to find a way to squeeze it into the Webpack configuration underneath the covers. And fortunately, for this, there is an official solution. We could extend the CLI with a so-called custom builder. The custom builder is just an exchangeable strategy that tells the CLI how to build this or that. The CLI ships with several default builders. For instance, the default builder for applications is delegating to Webpack. The default builder for libraries is delegating to ng packager. And we could now implement a custom builder that delegates the module federation config to Webpack underneath the covers. And then the custom builder can delegate to the default behavior, to the default Webpack builder, which tells Webpack, hey, please now build this application. So at the end of the day, this is a matter of, let's say, 50 lines of code, give or take. Of course, we could handwrite such a builder, but you don't need to, because I already did this for you. I already built such a builder. It's called Angular Architects Module Federation. You can just npm install or ng edit. And basically, it does three things for you. First of all, it generates the skeleton for your module federation configuration. That means you don't need to learn this configuration by heart. You get a skeleton, 1 or 2 pages long, and this skeleton just needs to be filled in. You just need to fill in the placeholders in the skeleton. That's the first thing this plugin does for you. The second thing this plugin does for you is installing a custom builder. A custom builder enabling module federation underneath the covers. And also, this is the third thing, it assigns a new board for ngserve. This is not a big deal, but it is quite convenient because having different boards for ngserve allows you to start your application side by side. One shell, several micro frontends side by side to try it out. To get started with this, you need 3 steps. First of all, you need to ng add this to your application. Then you need to adjust the generated configuration to fill out the placeholders in the configuration. And then you need to ngserve it, and that's all. So I would say, let's try that out. I'm always saying module federation is a bit like the 1980s. You need to experience them, otherwise you don't know what they are about. And that's why I've prepared a little demonstration for you. This demonstration here consists of a shell and of a micro frontend. And as you see here, both chains, this here runs at localhost 3000, the shell runs at localhost 5000. And now, here the shell has a root called flights. And when I'm clicking this very root, then we see nothing. because it hasn't been implemented yet. This is now our task during this live coding part. At the end of the day, what I want to achieve is I want to load this separately compiled and deployed micro frontend into this very route here. And to do this, let's move out to our console. When we here look to the example that runs here, let me start Studio Code. Then we see that our example is just a mono repository consisting of my micro frontend one and my shell. You don't need to go with a mono repo. You could also go with several repositories. But here, for the sake of simplicity, it is just one repository with my two separately compiled projects. If we look into the package JSON, we see that I'm going with Angular 11 and also, of course, with the CLI 11. The CLI 11 is by default using Webpack 4. And that's not a good message because we need Webpack 5 for module federation. So what to do here? Well, the good message is we can force the Angular CLI into Webpack 5. The Angular team did a lot of effort to make this possible. The Angular team, and by the way, also our next speaker of today, Dimitri, he also invested a lot of time to help the Angular team to make this possible, to provide an opt-in for Webpack 5 into the CLI 11. So Dimitri, I really thank you for this. This was really a great job you and the Angular team did there. That means we can tell the CLI to use Webpack 5. And for this, we need to use those sections here. This section here, resolutions with Webpack 5, is forcing each and every dependency that needs Webpack into version 5. Currently, this is experimental in the CLI. That means you should not use it for production. There are some pitfalls, but it's good enough to get started with it, to try it out, and to find out if this is the right solution for your big application. And hopefully with CLI 12 in spring, we have a sound Webpack 5 integration. The thing is also to respect this section here, you need to use yarn. NPM is not respecting this section out of the box. For NPM, there are some additional packages doing this. When you are going with yarn, you get out of the box support for this. Okay, awesome. This is what I did before. I forced it into Webpack 5 and I installed my dependencies with yarn. Now let's switch to my console. And here I have one tab for my shell. I have another tab for my micro frontend. Let's start with the micro frontend. Let's ng-add Angular architects module federation to enable module federation for my micro frontend one. This is now downloading the package, and then it will ask me two questions, namely, which application do you want to enable for module federation? The answer here is MFE1. And the second question is, which board do you want to use? And I want to go with board 3000. And bang, everything is now enabled for module federation. I'm getting several files generated and other files are updated. Under the generated files, I find this Webpack config. This contains the skeleton for my module federation configuration. You don't need to worry. This is not a fully blown Webpack configuration. It just limits to the points, to the entries you need for module federation. The rest is still generated by the CLI. This is the first thing. And the second thing I want to point out here is that this plugin is updating your Angular JSON to define the board in question, but also to register the custom builder, enabling module federation underneath the covers. Yeah, this is what I need to do for my micro frontend. Now let's do the same for the shell. Let's switch over to the tab for the shell. I'm entering this command one more time. Now it's the shell's turn. And for the shell, I want to go with board 5000. And the same stuff is generated and updated. Okay, let's jump to our source code. Here I'm starting with the micro frontend one. If we drill in here, we see we've got this Webpack config. And it's really only a partial Webpack config, just 2 screen pages, at least with my current font size. This contains everything we need for module federation. And first and foremost, this is about registering the module federation plugin. Here we've got 2 entries. Both are commented out. The first entry is for remotes, or let's say for micro frontends. The second entry is for hosts, or to put it in another way, it's for the shell. So here we talk about the micro frontend one. You see it here. That's why I'm going with the first section. I'm skipping the second one. My micro frontend gets a name, MFE1. Its remote entry point gets a name. You remember, this is the generated file with all the metadata for the shell. And here I can expose stuff, like a module, which is exposed, and it is found in the file flights.module. Okay. Also, I want to share some libraries like Angular Core, Common, and the router. On the slides, you've seen the simplified version of this. When you go with the simplified version, you just assign the name of the libraries to share with an array. Here I'm doing a bit more. Here I'm assigning an object, and this allows me to configure my shared libraries. For instance, the combination of singleton and strict version is telling module federation that only one major version of Angular Core shall be loaded. If there are 2 different major versions, or to put it in another way, 2 non-compatible versions, if you change the major version, you have a non-compatible breaking change by definition, then you will get an error here. You will immediately get an exception. Something like, hey, this shell is using Angular 10 and the micro frontend is using Angular 11. You will immediately get an exception in the sense of fail fast. If I would skip this strict version flag, I would only get a warning, plus I would get the highest version. Angular 10, Angular 11, we would go with Angular 11. You see, there are several strategies baked into module federation to deal with version conflicts. There are even some additional ones, but for the time being, let's stick with this here. If there are different versions, I want to get an error, I want to fail fast. Because obviously, no one can guarantee that Angular 10 works seamlessly together with Angular 11. It might work, but you have to try it out for your case. No guarantees. Fail fast. Okay, so basically, I just configured my micro frontend. Especially, I defined the files to expose, and I configured the libraries to share. If we look into my flight module, we see this is just an ordinary Angular module with child roots. That means if I load this module into my shell, I can route to the routes defined here. Now let's proceed with the shell. Let's close the micro frontend one. Let's proceed with the shell. Also, the shell has a Webpack configuration. It looks the same. Also, here we have 2 sections. One is for the remotes. I don't need it. The other one is for the host, which means shell in our case. So let's go with it. Here I just need to configure my micro frontends. I'm saying, hey, I want to map the URL MFE1, and it points over there to another micro frontend, which is also called MFE1 over there. And by the way, the remote entry point with all the metadata can be found here. This is what I'm calling static module federation. I'm directly hard coding the metadata, at least the location of the metadata. Static federation or static module federation. This is quite convenient for testing and also for debugging and for demonstrations, but obviously for live applications, for production-ready applications, this is not enough. For production-ready applications, you would go with an alternative, which I'm calling dynamic federation. And dynamic federation just means that you don't provide this information upfront. Instead of this, you provide it at runtime with some convenience function like load, remote, something like this, where you pass in this very URL. Of course, this is a bit more complicated because things become a bit more dynamic, but as mentioned, for production-ready application, you will very likely go with this. Here, I'm sticking with the simple static version. Okay, cool. So I can point over there to my micro frontend located at port 3000, and that's all I need to configure here. The shared section is the same. I want to share the same libraries. I shall also have a root configuration. App root. It's just a traditional Angular routing configuration, and here I can introduce a lazy route. And as all the lazy routes you know, it has a path and it has a load children property pointing to something that loads the lazy module. Here I'm going with a dynamic import statement, loading the module from over there from my micro frontend. And the best thing here is, one more time, Angular does not even know that we go with micro frontends. For Angular, this is just traditional lazy loading. But Webpack, underneath the covers, knows that this path has been mapped in the configuration, and so it grabs over and loads something from there. This works perfectly at runtime, but of course, at compile time, this file is not known because this file does not exist. Webpack will resolve it at runtime. And that's why TypeScript is complaining. See here, TypeScript is saying, this does not exist, this does not work, this might be a mistake. And now, because of this, we need to ease TypeScript. We need to tell, hey, TypeScript, it's okay, trust us, we are experts, we exist at runtime. To ease TypeScript, we need another file. The name doesn't matter as long as it ends with DTS. Declaration DDS, for instance. If it ends with DDS, TypeScript will pick it up at compile time. And here we can say, hey, we know you don't know this file, but trust us, it will be there. And if we switch back now, we see it's now fine for TypeScript. Quicklies are gone. Okay, that's it. So at the end of the day, you just need to configure module federations on both sides, and then you deal with lazy loading, perhaps using the router or perhaps with manually lazy loading components. That should be everything. So let's try it out. Let me start here my micro frontend, ng-serve mfe1. And at the same time, let's also start in the other tab, my shell serve shell -o. Of course, that takes some time now. You know, patience is a gift. The shell is built. Yeah, also the micro frontend was built. So here is everything green, and you know, if everything is green, you can ship it. No, please don't do it. By the way, we get sometimes a warning like this, but it is really just a warning, and you know, warnings are for hazards. No, just kidding. As mentioned before, the Webpack 5 integration for the CLI is still experimental. So please expect some warnings and some pitfalls. The same should be the case here for the shell. We have a warning and we have here the output. So let's try it out. Let's reload this. Here we have localhost 5000. And now when I'm click to flights, hey, my micro front end is loaded directly into the middle of my shell. Let's have a look to the network tab. Let's reload everything. Let's click here and you see this chunk is really only loaded on demand. This is our micro front end and only has 11.6Ks, which really proves that we are sharing Angular. If we loaded Angular a second time, this bundle would be far bigger. Nice. So we have achieved something that was not really possible before, loading stuff from another origin at runtime. Localhost 3000 plus localhost 5000 here. Perhaps you like this, and perhaps you are wondering now, hey Manfred, when can we use this? Well, the thing is, you can start using Webpack 5 immediately because Webpack 5 is final. Also, CLI 11 is final. But the thing is, the Webpack integration into CLI 11, the Webpack 5 integration into CLI 11 is currently experimental. That means you need to expect some pitfalls, some warnings, some issues. You can arrange yourself with it, but it is more something for enthusiasts and not intended for production. You can start with it to play around. You can start with it to make an example for your architecture. But if you want to use it for production, I would recommend to wait until CLI 12, which is due in spring 2021. It's just a matter of several months. If you really need to start now, start with your micro frontends, integrate them with hyperlinks for the time being, and then when everything is integrated nicely into the CLI, you can throw away your hyperlinks and replace the integration with a shell loading everything on demand. By the way, if you like this talk, you might also like my free ebook. I've updated it about 2 weeks ago. It now consists of 4 chapters regarding module federations and some additional chapters regarding other stuff you should also draw into consideration when going with micro frontends and module federation, stuff like domain-driven design, strategic design, NX monorepos, and web components. So you can download it for free. It's here at angulararchitects.io/book. Okay, let me come to a conclusion. We've seen that module federation allows you to do something that was not really possible before, at least not without dirty workarounds, namely it allows you to load separately deployed code. And this is the key for micro frontends, because micro frontends are separately deployed applications that are loaded into your shell on demand. And we've also seen we can combine this with Angular and the Angular CLI, just ng add this plugin and you are fine. And there is one last thing I want you always to remember, namely this now is the time to become the next Leonardo da Vinci. So take your chance, become the next Leonardo da Vinci, design something you can build today because you have the right material. So thanks for having me. I have already uploaded my slides and my examples to my blog, and here you also have my Twitter address if you want to follow me to keep a bit in contact. Thank you.
Great, super. Thanks for presentation. I can watch it again and again. So let's go to Q&A. What do we have here? I see I can highlight the question. So what's the difference for if we're speaking about probably Angular CLI and NX tool?
Yeah, so NX is an extension for the CLI. Everything I've shown today is possible with both, with the CLI and with NX. NX is an extension which brings several additional features like access restrictions. With NX, you can define that one micro frontend is not allowed to directly communicate with the other micro frontend. And that's vital because you don't want to mingle everything up with each other. Another feature of NX is incremental compilation. That means you don't need to compile everything all the time. You only need to compile the stuff that has been changed, which speeds up your whole CI process. And there are some other advantages that are really nice when working on big projects.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Next one. This. How can I
not a problem.
Share data between micro frontends? It should be something like SSO or common channel like Nginx.
Yeah, that's a good question. The thing is, we have seen that I can share libraries like Angular Core, Angular Common. And the same way, you could share your own library, and this library could contain a communication service. In the easiest version, it is just a service with a subject so that you can trigger some domain event, something like, hey, this user was not logged in. And here you have the access token for the user. And so all the other parts of the system can receive this message and can work with it, can take out the access token and use it to talk to the backend. So sharing services is here the key for also sharing data. As this question also includes NGRX, I would not directly use NGRX for communication because NGRX is quite a heavy dependency and this would couple your micro frontends to each other. So I would prevent this. I would go with a simple communication service.
Okay, good. Going to the next one from Vitaly. What about the case when shell doesn't know about remotes at the build time and need to configure at write time?
Yeah, so in this example, I configured everything at compile time for the sake of simplicity, but you can do the same at runtime. It is just a matter of one function call. If you look up my plugin, you find an example for this. And in this case, this function call defines the location of the micro frontend. So it would be possible to load some configuration data when starting the shell, configuration data telling the shell, hey, this micro frontend is today found here, and another brand new micro frontend is found there. And then you can use this metadata to load everything dynamically.
Okay, thank you. And the last one about how can I forbid the user to access this port directly?
Well, the thing is you cannot. And that's not an issue of module federation. It's a general issue. No one can prevent you from loading a single page application from a given location. If it is publicly available, everyone can load your single page application into his or her own application. There is not even a same origin policy because the same origin policy is not defined for script tags. It is not defined for script tags, for images and other stuff. So you cannot really prevent it. One way to prevent it in a corporate environment would be to have a web application firewall that doesn't gives you access to a specific URL without having a specific cookie or a specific access token. And perhaps you only get the cookie when you are logged in. But if we are speaking about publicly available micro frontends. You cannot avoid this.
Okay, good. Thank you. And one more question appeared. It's in Russian, but let me try. I'm not sure that I understand the meaning, but I'll try to translate. Maybe it will be clear for you. So, is it possible to load dynamically load libraries that were not hosted, like plugins? So I translated the question directly, but not sure whether you got the meaning.
So I suppose that this question is about sharing something like Angular Core or Angular Common, but you don't know upfront about those libraries. You really want to load them dynamically. So if you don't know about your shared libraries at compile time, if you don't know that you want to share Angular Core, Angular Common, then you need to go with traditional JavaScript. No one prevents you from creating a script tag dynamically, but you need to do this by yourself. There is no support from Module Federation for this. But you could, of course, load a script tag or a script with a dynamic script tag. Perhaps it just contains some functions that are put into the global namespace. Perhaps it contains some web components.
Okay, good. And one more, please. So it's super broad, probably. Best solution for having multiple micro frontend on one page.
Yeah, I think the best solution is what I've shown today, plus using dynamic federation, which means not hard coding everything, but finding out about the micro frontends at runtime. This is the best solution because it is straightforward and Webpack takes care of the heavy lifting underneath the covers. If you want to mix and match different frameworks in addition, then you need to combine this, what we've seen today, with web components. Then you have a React component and an Angular component, perhaps an Angular 10 component, an Angular 11 component, something like this. By the way, I've blogged about this week because this question comes on a regular basis. You find some information about this very question and also about other topics regarding this in my blog.
Okay, good. I think that's it. So the last question for you. What was the best question? We need to define who is getting the prize.
Well, best question. I think the question about communicating is quite important because you always need to communicate somehow. Of course, don't overdo it because you want to loosely couple your micro frontends to each other. You don't want to intermingle everything with each other, but normally you need several events to send back and forth. So this is quite a vital thing, if you ask me.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you very much for presentation and answering all the questions.
Thanks for having me. It was really a pleasure to be here.
We'll be glad to see you again somewhere on next meetups.
Cool.
And maybe conferences. Okay, good. We are moving forward to the next speaker. Let me add him to the stream and the